My name is Virginia Callahan. And if you think turning 80 means turning invisible, you've never met me. I was born in 1945 after the war ended, when people believed the future was something you could build brick by brick, word by word. I did just that. I built a life, a home, a family. I didn't just survive decades, I authored them. I raised 2 children, loved one man faithfully until the end, and never once asked for pity, only respect. And yet, on my 80th birthday, respect was the last thing I received. You might actually regret missing out on this dramatic story. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because this isn't just a story about getting old. It's a story about what happens when your own blood decides you're easier to manage when locked away, and what one woman can do when silence is no longer an option. The day started beautifully. I woke up in the creaky old house my husband and I bought in 1971. I'd made myself coffee in the same blue enamel percolator I'd used since the kids were born. The sunlight came in strong, pouring through the windows and warming the hardwood floors where my cat Juniper stretched lazily. I'd even bought myself a tiny lemon tart from that French bakery down on Hemlock Avenue, one treat just for me. I wasn't expecting much from my family. A call from my daughter, maybe. A card from my son if he remembered. So when they both showed up at 9 a.m., sharp unannounced, I was stunned. Emily, my daughter, was dressed in beige, the color of guilt, if you ask me. Mark, my son, looked like he had somewhere more important to be. "Happy birthday, Mom," Emily chirped, holding a bunch of helium balloons and a paper bag that smelled like croissants. Mark added, "Thought we'd take you for a birthday brunch." I blinked. "Well, all right," I said. "Let me grab my purse." They were already ushering me to the car. I didn't notice then that the bag of croissants had no receipt, that my name wasn't on any of the balloons. I should have known. The drive was unusually long. We passed downtown where brunch places lived and kept going. I asked where we were headed. "You'll see," Mark mumbled. Emily smiled into the windshield. "It's a surprise." I remember a strange stillness in my chest as we turned off the freeway and pulled onto a quiet lane lined with tall oak trees, the kind that cast long shadows even in the morning sun. At the end of the drive stood a modern complex, clean lines, big windows. A cheerful sign at the entrance read, "Willow Grove Senior Living, where every day feels like home." Mark parked. Emily unbuckled. I didn't move. "We're here," Emily said too softly. "Where is here?" I asked. They looked at each other. Then Mark sighed. "Mom, we didn't want to overwhelm you with details, but we've arranged a place for you here. It's beautiful, safe. They have activities. You'll make friends." My heart beat like a war drum. "What do you mean arranged? This isn't what I want." Emily touched my hand, but her voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "It's for your own good." I noticed then that Mark was unloading a suitcase from the trunk. "My suitcase? You packed my things?" He didn't answer, just kept unloading, methodical, efficient, like a bellhop at a hotel I never booked. I got out of the car, slowly. The air smelled like pine needles and lavender cleaner. An attendant was already walking toward us with a clipboard. I whispered, "I want to go home." Emily leaned in. "You'll get used to it. It's time to let us take care of you." As if care was something I'd surrendered. As if the decades I spent raising them were erased with a parking pass and a smile. They led me to a small pre-furnished unit. Clean, blonde, the kind of place where personality goes to die. On the nightstand was a brochure. "Welcome to Willow Grove. A new chapter begins." I opened a drawer. My favorite shawl was folded neatly inside. I hadn't even noticed them packing. Everything was already here, except me. Mark and Emily left quickly, said they had appointments, the cowards exit. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed back, stiff lips tight. My knees didn't tremble. My voice didn't crack. But inside me something sank, a pressure like a dam trying to hold. And I thought, if this is my new chapter, I'll be the one to write it. The silence after they left was louder than anything I'd ever heard. No familiar hum of my refrigerator. No creak of the floorboard outside my bedroom. Just the dull murmur of televisions behind closed doors and the distant whir of a vacuum in some hallway I didn't know. I sat there in that sterile little room, and stared at the welcome packet like it was a death sentence. It was printed on thick, glossy paper, too cheerful, too colorful, as if illustrations of shuffleboard tournaments and yoga for seniors could erase the fact that I had been quietly exiled. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Not yet. But something in me cracked. Not loudly. Not violently. Just enough to feel the air escape. I've lived through loss before my husband, my parents, my closest friends. But this felt different. This wasn't death. It was erasure. They had decided I was no longer useful, no longer sharp enough, no longer safe. Not in their eyes, at least. And instead of a conversation, a family meeting, or even a warning, they gave me balloons and a bag of cold pastries and dumped me behind a gate with a code. That was the most humiliating part. There was a code to get out. A nurse named Tasha came in to acclimate me. Young, kind, almost unnervingly gentle. "I just want to make sure you have everything you need," she said with a smile. I wanted to ask her if she knew I'd been kidnapped politely. Instead, I said, "Do people usually come here by surprise?" She paused, just long enough for me to know she knew. Sometimes families don't know how to have that conversation. They think it's kinder to do it all at once. Kinder, I echoed. She gave me the tour. There was a common room with chairs bolted to the floor, a small library with more puzzles than books, a dining room with assigned seating. "Do I get to choose where I sit?" I asked. "Well, we usually assign based on activity level and mobility, but if you'd like." "No," I said. "That's fine." I didn't want to fight every little thing, not yet. I needed my energy. When we returned to the room, I asked if I could go outside for some fresh air. Tasha smiled again apologetically this time. "Of course, but you'll need to ask the desk for the gate code." I looked at the door. It had a lock. On the inside. That night, I lay in bed with the lights off and listened. I listened to the shuffling footsteps of someone 2 doors down, to the faint laughter of a group watching TV, to the echo of my own thoughts. And then I heard it. Someone crying. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a slow, steady weep. A weep that sounded practiced. I didn't sleep, not because I couldn't, but because I refused to let this place own even my dreams. The next morning, I tried to call Emily. Straight to voicemail. I left a message. "I'm fine, but we need to talk." "This wasn't your decision to make." I never got a reply. Then I called Mark. He answered. "Mom," he said flatly. "Why?" I asked. "That's all. Just why?" He sighed. "We talked about this, Mom. You've been forgetting things. You fell last month." I tripped on the rug, I said. "I didn't break a bone. I didn't even bruise. You live alone. It's not safe. This place is—" "You think safety is the same as freedom?" He went quiet, and I realized he wasn't going to apologize. Not now. Maybe not ever. So I said something I hadn't planned to. "I'm not staying here." He laughed short, tired. "You don't have a choice." That was the moment. That was when the crack inside me didn't widen. It sealed. With something harder than before. Resolve. That afternoon, I took a walk around the building, memorizing exits, cameras, schedules. Not because I planned to escape. Not yet. But because that's what you do when you're in a place you didn't choose. You map it. You study it. You wait. I noticed other residents. Some sat in chairs facing windows like ghosts waiting for the world to knock. Others shuffled silently in slippers, eyes lowered. But one caught my attention. A woman with steel gray curls and a cardigan with the words, "Go away, I'm retired," embroidered across the back. She sat in the garden with a book and a glare that could cut concrete. I sat beside her. She didn't look up. "I'm Virginia," I said. "Let me guess. Dumped here by your loving family." I blinked. "Yes." She turned a page. "Name's Jeanette. Don't get comfortable." That night, I opened the desk drawer and pulled out my old journal. I hadn't written in months, but now I had so much to say. I wrote about the moment they drove me in. The look in Emily's eyes, not malice, just calculation. The guilt in Mark's posture buried beneath his logic. The unbearable silence of my empty bedroom back home. I wrote because my voice was taken, but my words were still mine. And I'd be damned if I let them fade quietly. Over the next few days, I learned what it meant to be contained without chains. Every hour had a rhythm. Breakfast at 7:30, chair yoga at 9, lunch at 11, fame, bingo at 2, dinner by 5, lights out by 9. I didn't follow it. Not out of rebellion, but because it wasn't mine. The moment I accepted their schedule was the moment I started dissolving into someone else's design. Jeanette, my sharp-tongued new friend, noticed. "You don't eat in the dining hall," she said one morning, sipping instant coffee from a chipped mug. "I'm not hungry at 11:40 fame." She nodded approvingly. "Good. Keep it up. The minute you conform, they stop seeing you as a person and start filing you as a patient." She had rules, Jeanette. She never wore the facility-issued slippers. She refused to participate in mood check-ins. She called the staff by their first names unless they annoyed her. Then she called them Nurse Ratched. "You'll get used to it," she said. The locked doors. The fake concern. The way they tell you how lucky you are while your whole life is disappearing behind you. But I didn't want to get used to it. I wanted out. I started small. I asked the front desk for the facility's residence rights packet. The clerk blinked twice clearly, not expecting someone to read fine print. I read every word. Then I asked for the directory of staff. The real one. The one with surnames and departments. I found the name I needed. Sarah Lynn, administrator. She was in charge of resident affairs, which sounded like a bad soap opera, but I made an appointment anyway. When I walked into her office, she was surprised to see me standing without a walker. "Mrs. Callahan, what can I do for you? I want to understand what legal authority my children had to admit me here without my consent." She blinked. "Well, they're listed as your medical decision makers." I stopped her. "Under an old power of attorney I gave my son when I had surgery 5 years ago. I've since revoked it." More blinking. "Do you have documentation of that?" "I do. And you'll have a copy by tomorrow." She didn't argue, but I saw it in her face. This one won't go quietly. That night, I went back to my room and did something I hadn't done in years. I called an old friend. Her name was Ruth Delgado, former colleague from the days when I was a civil rights attorney. We hadn't spoken in years, not because of bad blood, but because life gets tangled. But I knew if anyone could help me untangle it now, it was her. When she picked up, her voice cracked with time and affection. "Virginia," she said. "Is that you?" "It is," I replied. "And I need a favor." "A big one." I told her everything: how my children lured me with kindness and boxed me in with guilt. How my power of attorney had been used like a weapon. How I was trapped not by locks, but by perception. Ruth didn't ask if I was exaggerating. She knew me better than that. She just said, "Email me the paperwork. I'll have a look." And Virginia, yes, you're not old. You're furious. There's a difference. The next morning, I found a yellow envelope under my door. Inside was a printed email. It read, "Dear Mrs. Callahan, after review of the attached revocation notice and prior documents, it appears your admission may have involved invalid legal authority. I am pursuing this matter with urgency. R. Delgado-esque." I folded it slowly, like a flag after battle. Then I made copies, and I began to leave them. One in Sarah Lynn's mailbox, one with Nurse Tasha, who barely blinked but looked shaken, one taped discreetly on the bulletin board next to the sign-up sheet for movie night. But I didn't stop there. I started writing a daily letter, not to my children, but to myself. Letters of memory, of strength, of resistance. "Dear Virginia, they thought you would shrink. They thought you would fade. But you are more than age. You are fire with a soft voice. You are not a guest in this life. You are the architect." These weren't just words. They were anchors. Each time I reread them, I felt myself return. I also started talking to other residents. Not small talk, real talk. I asked how they got here. One said my daughter said she'd visit every week. It's been 2 years. Another whispered, "I gave my house to my son so he could manage my estate. Now I have no house." I started keeping a log. Notes. Patterns. Jeanette noticed. "You starting a revolution?" she asked. "Maybe." "Well," she grinned, "if we burn this place down, I want the matches." That afternoon, I walked by the main office and heard a staff member say, "She's not like the others." I didn't flinch. Because I wasn't a number. I wasn't a patient. I wasn't done. By the end of the first week, the tone of the staff shifted. Not openly, not with words, but in glances, in hesitations. I noticed how conversations paused when I entered a room. I noticed how my file left open once on a desk had a yellow sticky note that read, "Watch for escalation." Escalation. As if asking for autonomy, for legal clarity, for simple human respect, was a threat. I wasn't escalating. I was remembering who I was, who I still am. A woman who spent 4 decades fighting for people's voices to be heard. A woman who trained attorneys challenged unfair school policies and once walked out of a courtroom in tears after defending a mother wrongly evicted from public housing. I didn't lose all that at 80. I didn't misplace it like a coat. I had simply been told to tuck it away, and for a moment, I believed them. But now I was folding it back on like armor. On a Tuesday during music therapy, I sat in the back and watched an enthusiastic intern strum a guitar and sing, "You Are My Sunshine," like it was some ancient hymn meant to soothe broken people. Jeanette leaned in. "You want to know the real therapy here?" "What?" "Watching you make the staff nervous. It's the best entertainment I've had in years." We both chuckled quietly so we wouldn't be labeled disruptive, but our laughter felt like resistance. Across the room, a man named Harold, who never spoke, mouthed the lyrics. Later, I found a note in my room. Folded unsigned. "What you're doing matters. Don't stop." That afternoon, I requested a town hall for residents. A formal meeting. With questions. With minutes. With accountability. Sarah Lynn declined verbally, so I submitted the request in writing, then posted a printed copy of my rights next to the vending machine. One sentence highlighted: residents have the right to participate in community decisions affecting their quality of life. 2 days later, a notice went up. Resident Council meeting, Friday 3 p.m., Community Room A. No mention of who requested it. No mention of why. But it didn't matter. The door was open, and I intended to walk through it. I called Ruth again. "Can you be there?" "Virtually." "Of course," she said. "And Virginia, record everything." I planned to. I borrowed a small voice recorder from the library and tucked it into my sweater. Then I wrote my questions. Who signed my admission form and under what authority? What are the criteria for discharge and who determines them? How often are residents consulted before major decisions are made on their behalf? And finally, what safeguards are in place to prevent families from misusing power of attorney? Friday came like judgment. At 3 p.m., the room was full. Not just residents, but staff, nurses, 2 administrators, and Sarah Lynn with a clipboard and a smile so tight it could have cut glass. She opened the meeting with generic praise. "We're here to celebrate our community." I raised my hand. She ignored it. I raised it again. Jeanette cleared her throat. So did Harold. Soon, half the room had a hand up. Sarah couldn't pretend forever. "Yes, Mrs. Callahan." I stood not to be dramatic, but because standing still meant something. My question is simple. Who decides when a person stops being allowed to choose for herself? Silence. I ask because that's what happened to me. I was placed here without consent. My legal rights ignored. My voice discarded. And I'm not the only one. I scanned the room, saw nods, saw tears, heard the creak of someone sitting straighter. "I'm 80, I said. Not broken. Not senile, not invisible. You don't get to pretend I'm lucky to be warehoused just because the walls are painted pastel." A slow clap came from the back. Jeanette. Then more. Then silence again. But this time, not empty silence. Weighty silence. Silence full of meaning. Sarah shifted in her chair. "I appreciate your concerns, Mrs. Callahan. We'll take them under advisement." I smiled. "I'm not here for advisement. I'm here for correction." That night, Ruth called me. "You've gone viral," she said, laughing. "What?" "Someone recorded part of your speech. A staffer, I think. It's circulating in elder rights forums. They're calling you the Lioness of Willow Grove." I laughed for the first time in days, and I said softly to myself more than her, "Let them hear me roar." The following morning, I woke to a knock. Not the soft courtesy tap of a nurse doing rounds, but the deliberate rap of someone carrying consequence. It was Sarah Lynn. "Good morning, Mrs. Callahan," she said, holding a folder against her chest like a shield. "May I come in?" I stood aside. She walked in without waiting for an answer. That told me everything. She sat on the guest chair near my small writing desk, but I remained standing. I wanted to see how uncomfortable she'd get having to look up at me. She opened the folder, cleared her throat, and said, "There's been some concern regarding your influence on the resident population." I almost laughed. Influence. As if I was some underground insurgent. "I'm not spreading rebellion," I said calmly. "I'm spreading awareness." She nodded tight-lipped. "We've received notice from your attorney regarding your current residency status. We're reviewing it carefully. In the meantime," I asked. "In the meantime," she said slowly, "we ask that you refrain from distributing legal material without administrative approval." I leaned in slightly. "Are my words considered contraband now?" Her mouth tightened. "We just want to maintain peace." "Then perhaps you should start by asking why so many of us feel like prisoners in a building designed to look like a resort." She stood, folder still clutched. "I'll be in touch." And then she left. No goodbye, no warmth. Just the soft click of the door, an echo I was learning too well. That evening, I sat in the courtyard. The hydrangeas were starting to bloom, though someone had trimmed them too tightly, trying to keep nature orderly. Jeanette joined me as she always did. She carried a mug of tea and an old notepad filled with poems she never shared. She looked spooked, she said, referring to Sarah. "She's realizing the walls don't hold what they used to." Jeanette smirked. "You're turning this place into a courtroom." "Good," I said. "It's long overdue." Then Harold appeared. Slowly but deliberately. He nodded at us and sat in the third chair. He hadn't said a word in public until that week. He cleared his throat, then spoke. "May I read something?" Jeanette and I blinked. He pulled out a folded sheet of paper and began, "To grow old is not to grow useless. It is to carry the library of your life in fragile hands, and still lend out chapters to those who listen." When he finished, we were silent. But it wasn't the sad silence of the hallways. It was the kind of silence that comes after someone lights a candle in a dark room. "You wrote that?" I asked. He nodded. "I haven't shared it before." "Why now?" "Because you reminded me I could." The next day, I asked the facility if I could host a weekly writing circle for residents. Not therapy, not bingo, not crafts, stories, real ones. At first, they hesitated. Then, likely hoping to contain the energy I was stirring, they approved it. We held our first meeting in the old chapel, which no one had used in years. 9 residents came. We sat in a circle of mismatched chairs and read parts of our lives aloud. One woman, Doris, spoke of losing her husband in a snowstorm and raising 5 kids on grit alone. A man named Edward read about watching the moon landing on a black and white TV while holding his newborn daughter. And me, I read from the journal I had started the night I arrived. Not all of it. Just one entry. Day 3. The room is clean. The sheets are crisp, but there's no space here for the life I lived. So I built a new space word by word. We cried. We laughed. And for the first time since being locked behind that code-controlled door, I felt something return. Ownership. Of my voice. Of my story. Of myself. Later that week, I received an envelope under my door again. But this time, it wasn't from Ruth. It was handwritten. No return name. Inside was a single sentence. "You don't know me, but I've been listening. You reminded me I'm not done yet." I stared at that note for a long time. Then I tucked it into my journal. It stayed there like a pressed flower between pages. A memory that still bloomed. Then something shifted. Staff stopped calling me dear. They called me Mrs. Callahan. The recreational director asked if I'd consider speaking at the next open house. Sarah Lynn requested a resident leadership chat. Even the food changed, small things like real butter and less gelatin. I hadn't escaped yet. I hadn't even packed a bag. But already, I was no longer invisible. They didn't know it yet, but I was getting ready. Because this wasn't the end. It was the gathering of storm clouds before the thunder. And when it came, I would not whisper. I would roar. By the second week, I knew every hallway in Willow Grove by heart. I knew which nurse would pretend not to see if I stayed in the garden too long. I knew when the delivery truck arrived. I knew the exact timing of the administrator's coffee breaks. Patterns, loops, habits. They weren't just details, they were architecture, and I was mapping my way out. But freedom isn't always about leaving. Sometimes it's about reclaiming your place where you already stand. One afternoon, while walking past the front desk, I overheard something that made me stop. "She's stirring things up," a staff member whispered to another. "They're calling her the professor." The professor? I smiled. I hadn't taught in years, but perhaps I had never stopped. That same day, a man named Alvin approached me during lunch. A quiet man with trembling hands and pale blue eyes that rarely rose above his tray. "My granddaughter won't visit me anymore," he said softly, "because I told her I didn't want to sell the house." He paused, waiting for my judgment. She said I was selfish, that I was holding up her dream. He looked down again. I reached across the table and gently touched his hand. "You're not selfish," I said. "You're still the owner of your story. No one gets to edit your ending but you," Alvin cried. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to break me a little. That night, I added something new to my journal. They don't just take your room, they take your role, from protector to burden, from teacher to task, and they smile while doing it. I read that entry aloud at our next writing circle. No one spoke for a long time, and then Jeanette broke the silence. "Let's do something they can't ignore." We decided to write an anthology, a collection of personal essays by Willow Grove residents, real stories, real voices. We called it Still Here, Words from the Walls They Built. I asked Ruth to help us self-publish. She was delighted and furious. "You're making change," she said. "From the inside. I'll handle the legal paperwork and ISBN." Within days, we had 20 residents participating. A woman who had survived polio wrote about being locked in an iron lung as a child and how this facility reminded her of that same helplessness. A man who once worked as a jazz drummer shared how rhythm used to be his rebellion, and now silence was his prison. Even Harold contributed a second poem. The writing circle grew. Residents who hadn't spoken in weeks began scribbling notes on napkins. Nurses began staying after hours just to listen. One night, even Sarah Lynn sat quietly in the back. No clipboard, no defense. I didn't acknowledge her. Not out of pettiness, but because this wasn't about her anymore. It was about us. Then something happened I didn't expect. My daughter Emily showed up, unannounced. She found me in the garden notebook in lap, surrounded by a half circle of residents reciting drafts. Her face was pale. "Mom," she said. I didn't stand. "Emily." She glanced at the group and then back at me. "Can we talk?" I motioned to the bench across from me. She sat, awkward, like she was the child again. "I saw the video," she said. "The speech. Online." "Ah, so that's what brought her back. I didn't know you felt that way." I looked at her, hard. "That's because you didn't ask." She flinched. Then she whispered, "We were scared. Mark and I, we didn't know what to do." "You were alone. And stubborn. You thought it would be easier to move me than talk to me." She swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," she said. "I truly am." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. She wasn't there for my forgiveness. She was there because the world had seen me. And that made her wonder why she hadn't. Before she left, she handed me an envelope. My lawyer drew up some documents. "Just in case. If you want to transfer control of your affairs back to yourself." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean take back what was already mine?" She nodded. "And this time I did stand. You can tell your lawyer thank you. But I've already handled it. Months ago. You just never asked." She stood too. "I deserve that," she said. "Yes," I replied. "You did." After she left, Jeanette appeared beside me like a ghost with timing. She looked like she walked into her own funeral. I chuckled. "She kind of did." Jeanette nodded toward the notebook in my hand. "You writing about this?" "Every word." She smiled. "Good. Because we're not done yet." There's a peculiar power in being underestimated. It lets you move without permission. Speak without fear. It gives you the gift of surprise, and by the third week, I had become a walking surprise. The anthology was nearly finished. Ruth had connected us with a small press that offered discounted services for elder-led projects. Residents who had never held a published book were now seeing drafts with their names on the cover. Still here. Words from the walls they built had gone from whispered idea to undeniable truth. And suddenly Willow Grove didn't know what to do with us. We weren't frail. We were authors. One afternoon, while proofreading one of the final pieces, a heartbreaking memory from a former nurse who'd once lost her license for blowing the whistle on abuse, I received a visitor I didn't expect. Mark, my son. He stood in the doorway holding a bouquet of white tulips. His tie was loose, his smile even looser. Hi, Mom. I didn't get up. I didn't smile. Emily sent you? No, he said, sitting awkwardly across from me. She told me you were different, that I should come see for myself. I waited. He looked around the room, noticed the writing on the walls. Literally pages from the anthology hung like artwork, each one handwritten or typed in the voice of its creator. This is impressive, he said. I didn't know you were doing all this. That's because you never asked? I said, echoing what I'd told his sister. He nodded slowly. Mom, he said, we thought we were helping? I set the manuscript down. No, I said. You thought you were managing. He flinched, the way men do when truth lands without volume. I'm sorry, he said. It was arrogant and lazy. We thought putting you somewhere safe would free us from worrying, from guilt, from conversation, and from me. That stopped him cold. We sat there for a long minute, the hum of the radiator the only sound between us. Then he pulled a document from his coat pocket. I signed over the house back to your name. I never should have touched it. That got me, not because of the house, but because he understood, finally, that this was never about square footage or floor plans. It was about agency, dignity, the right to remain the author of my life. That evening, I told the writing circle about it. Jeanette scoffed. Took him long enough. If he were my son, I'd have made him wear that deed like a sandwich board. Harold smiled. Maybe now they'll see what we see. And for a moment, I let myself hope that maybe healing was possible. But redemption, like revenge, requires more than one good act. It requires remembrance. By now, word of our project had spread. A local newspaper ran a small feature on us titled The Rebels of Room 217. A journalist had come by, interviewed us. He left stunned. These stories, he'd said, aren't just moving. They're indictments. He wasn't wrong. The essays weren't polished memoirs. They were battle cries, love letters, death notes, confessions and calls to action. They were alive, and soon they would be public. Then Sarah Lynn requested a private meeting. This time I agreed. Her office was colder than before. She sat straighter, but her eyes flickered with something new. Not defensiveness. Caution. I've read the manuscript, she began. I didn't ask how she got it. And there are concerns. Legal ones. No. Reputation. I leaned back. Then, you should be very concerned. She folded her hands. Is this really how you want to be remembered? As the woman who turned a care facility into a courtroom, I smiled slow and steady. No. I want to be remembered as the woman who turned a cage into a classroom. She didn't have a reply. I stood. This meeting is over. On the way out, I passed the board in the lobby where the staff used to post birthdays and bingo nights. Now it featured something else. A flyer. Coming soon book launch event. Still here. Readings by residents. Light refreshments served. All are welcome, especially those who forgot we're still alive. No one claimed to have written that last line, but I had a guess. Jeanette. That night, I found another folded note on my pillow. Same handwriting as the last anonymous message. Your fire lit mine. I signed up for a community college course next fall. Thank you. No name, no address, just truth. And so I wrote one final entry for the day. They thought locking the doors would contain us. But they forgot. Some fires don't burn out. They spread. The day of the book launch arrived with a kind of electricity I hadn't felt in years. The kind that hums under your skin when something bigger than you is about to happen. It started with whispers, then wheelchairs moving faster than usual, cardigans pressed, hair curled, lipstick applied with trembling fingers that hadn't cared about color in months. We weren't just attending an event. We were reclaiming the spotlight. And this time, we weren't just in the room. We were the reason it existed. The community hall had never looked better. A white linen table stretched across the front, stacked high with our printed anthologies. The covers were matte black with gold lettering embossed across the front. Still here, words from the walls they built. By the residents of Willow Grove. Nuegitor. No ghostwriter. Just us. Each chair in the room had a printed name tag. Each attendee had a program. There were pictures of lemonade trays of cookies and floral centerpieces arranged by the activities coordinator, who once told me to embrace bingo. Now she looked like she wanted to apologize without words. Good. Let her. The first speaker was Harold. He read his poem slowly, deliberately, his once quiet voice now steady and undeniable. They came for my calendar, and took the clocks too, as if time were no longer mine to own. But I remember, I built decades. I raised time itself. When he finished, no one moved for a full 5 seconds. Then came the thunder of claps. Not polite, not performative, pure release. Next came Doris, who once told us she hadn't spoken in front of strangers since her wedding in 1952. She read about the day her husband died in her arms on their front porch. About how she sat with his body for 3 hours because the sun was warm and she didn't want him to go cold too quickly. People cried, openly, and then she added, and yet that moment felt more intimate than anything I've experienced since coming here. Until this. Jeanette went next. Of course she didn't read something she wrote. She read something someone else did. My friend Edna passed before this launch. She said she was writing something for it. She never finished it. But I'll read what she left behind. And then, with only 2 paragraphs, she made the whole room ache. My hands don't work like they used to. But they remember the shape of my son's head. They remember sewing his Halloween costume. And now they tremble for no reason. Like ghosts still holding a child who no longer calls. Even the staff wept. Some quietly left the room. They weren't ready for this. They weren't ready to meet the people they cared for. As equals, as humans, as storytellers. Then it was my turn. I stepped to the podium. No paper, no notes, just presence. I came here on my 80th birthday, I began. Not by choice, not by accident either. I was placed here by people who thought love meant control. That fear looked like care. That silence equaled peace. I scanned the room. I let that silence grow for a few days, until I realized, if I didn't speak, they would write the ending for me. I paused, and I'm not done. A smattering of claps, then more, then all. But I wasn't done yet. I leaned closer to the microphone. And neither are any of you. After the readings, we held a signing. People lined up, not just residents, but family members, volunteers, a few journalists who'd caught wind of the event, even some of the aides. Each of us signed copies of the anthology, our names, our hands, our lives. One young nurse leaned in while I signed her copy. My grandmother couldn't talk when she passed. She said, eyes red, I wish she could have been here. She is, I whispered, tapping the book. She cried and hugged me. I let her. Not because she needed it, but because I did. Later that evening, Ruth called. You're a sensation, she said. I rolled my eyes. Don't start. No, really. A publisher just reached out. They want to include your group in a national speaking tour on elder voices. I laughed. You want me to take this show on the road? I want people to hear what's possible when one woman refuses to disappear. I went quiet. Not because I doubted her, but because part of me still didn't recognize myself. And yet the truth was undeniable. I had been buried, and I had clawed back to the surface using nothing but a pen and a voice. That night in my journal I wrote, today we turned an assisted living facility into a living testament, not to survival, but to authorship. We are not done. We are in revision. A few days after the launch, the energy at Willow Grove shifted. Not subtly, not quietly. It tilted. People walked straighter, lingered longer in common spaces. Eye contact lasted more than a second. It was as if the walls once plastered in invisibility had grown windows, and we could finally see one another. Even the staff seemed human again. Not handlers, but witnesses. The anthology sold out its first local print run within a week. Ruth emailed me with the news. More orders from out of state. An elder rights organization wants to use it in their training. They're asking if you'll record a foreword. I hadn't cried in a while, but I did then. Not from sadness, from relief. Relief that I hadn't imagined my value. That it didn't vanish when my hair went silver or when my bones ached in the morning. It had just been waiting for me to reclaim it. Sarah Lynn called for another meeting. I almost declined, but something told me to go. This time I entered her office with a small stack of the anthologies under my arm. She stood when I walked in. I read every word she said quietly, and she lowered herself slowly into her chair. She looked different, smaller somehow. Not in stature and armor. I'm resigning. I blinked. She smiled faintly. Not because of you, not directly, but because of what you've stirred here. You forced me to see how much of my job had become about keeping things easy, not keeping them right. I set the books on her desk, one by one. You're not the villain, Sarah, I said. But you let the system write your script. I just chose not to follow mine. She looked at me. Truly. Looked for the first time. You were never supposed to be here, she said. Not like this. None of us were, I replied. 2 weeks later, a new administrator was introduced. A woman named Priya, young, energetic, curious. She requested a meeting with the writing circle her first day. You all built something rare, she said, and I want to know how to keep it alive. Jeanette raised an eyebrow. First rule, don't call us young at heart. We're old. We've earned it. The room laughed. So did Priya. It was a start. In the weeks that followed, we began building new rituals. Friday story salons, where residents read from their past journals or wrote new reflections on the week. The loud table at lunch, reserved for those who wanted real conversation, not small talk. A bulletin board titled, Before I Go, I Want You to Know, where residents could anonymously post lessons, regrets, or wisdom. The board filled faster than anyone expected. One note read, I loved my wife more after she died than I ever told her while she was alive. Tell yours now. Another, I kept my paintings in a closet because my husband said they were messy. He's gone. The closet is empty. The wall is full. And another, I stopped wearing perfume because my daughter said it made me smell old. I wear it again now. It smells like me. I read every single one. So did others. My relationship with Emily and Mark remained cautious but warmer. They visited more often. They asked instead of assumed. They even offered to bring me home, but I declined. Why? Emily had asked, genuinely confused. Because I'm doing something here, I said. Something I can't do from my armchair at home. She smiled. You've changed. No, I said. I've returned. One afternoon, I visited room 112. It used to belong to Edna, the woman whose unfinished letter Jeanette had read at the launch. I hadn't entered it since she passed. But a new resident had moved in. Her name was Grace. She was 79, recently widowed, moved in by her son. I knocked softly. Come in, she called voice, wary. When I entered, she looked at me with that familiar mix of grief and defiance. I heard about you, she said. All true, I replied, setting a book on her table. This is for you. She looked down at the cover. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Is this yours? Ours, I corrected. She closed the book and looked at me. Really? Looked. Can I tell you something? Anything. I don't want to disappear here. You won't, I said. And I meant it. Because we were building a place where stories didn't go to die. They went to live louder. That night, I sat in the chapel alone finally. The stained glass windows cast colorful shadows across the floor. I lit a single candle, then opened my journal, and wrote, This is not a facility. This is a forge, where identity once buried is melted and reshaped. And I am the flame. The next major shift didn't come from inside Willow Grove. It came from outside. From a letter. A real one, thick embossed, postmarked from Washington, D.C. Ruth handed it to me with that look only old friends can give. Equal parts awe and amusement. It's from the Department of Aging, she said. I may have submitted the anthology for a National Senior Advocacy Award. I stared at her. You did what? She grinned. You started a fire, Virginia. I just made sure someone outside saw the smoke. I opened the envelope. The seal cracked like old promises. Inside was a formal invitation to speak on a panel in the capital about elder autonomy and creative resistance. They wanted me, an 80-year-old woman involuntarily placed in a care facility on her birthday, to tell the country what aging actually looks like when dignity is allowed to speak for itself. I read it once, twice, a third time. Then I handed it to Jeanette. She read it silently, then said, "Well, damn. Pack your scarf and your sass. You're going national." Word spread fast. By the next day, the entire facility was buzzing. Residents were hugging me in hallways. Staff members were asking for selfies. Even Priya, the new administrator, beamed with pride. "This is what transformation looks like," she told the community during lunch. "This is what happens when we listen instead of manage." Harold started calling me Senator Callahan. Jeanette wouldn't stop practicing her fake Secret Service salute. But beneath all the joy, I felt something deeper. Validation. Not for the award, not for the trip, but for every word I hadn't swallowed. Every no I'd dared to question. Every truth I'd written when they thought I was simply adjusting to being parked somewhere quiet. Preparations began quickly. A local university offered to sponsor my trip. The anthology was going into its third printing, and I received a personal letter from a 17-year-old high school senior who'd read our stories in her sociology class. She wrote, "I used to think old people were just waiting to die. Now I realize some are just waiting to be heard. Thank you for showing me what strength really looks like." That letter hit me harder than anything else, because it reminded me this wasn't just about us. This was about legacy, about making sure the next generation understands that growing older isn't growing obsolete. It's growing deeper, sharper, more essential. The day before I left for D.C., Mark visited. He looked better, softer, less burdened by his own guilt. He sat beside me in the garden, the one I used to walk through with silent fury. "Mom," he said, "I told a colleague about everything that happened, and she asked me what finally changed you." I raised an eyebrow. "Changed me?" He nodded. And I told her, "You didn't change. You just remembered you didn't need permission." That silenced me, in the best way. Then he reached into his bag and handed me a small box. Inside was a brooch, simple, gold, shaped like a quill. "It belonged to Dad's mother," he said. "I thought maybe you'd wear it when you speak." I fastened it to my sweater immediately. It gleamed in the sunlight like truth. The trip was surreal. The capital was colder than I expected. Grand but impersonal. But when I stepped onto that stage wearing that brooch and a calm smile, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. I spoke of dignity, of silencing, of how easy it is to mistake management for care, and how stories, real, unfiltered, sometimes inconvenient, are the most radical kind of freedom. I told them about Jeanette and Harold and Doris. I told them about Edna's unfinished letter. I read from my journal. They didn't take my freedom in one blow. They took it with smiles, with soft words, with, "This is for your own good." And I let them until I remembered. I've survived too much to be softened into silence. When I finished, the room stood. People cried. A senator hugged me. A policymaker asked for a copy of the anthology. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt right. As if the world had finally realigned around a truth I'd always known. I was never meant to fade. I was meant to echo. That night, back in my hotel room, I sat by the window and stared at the Capitol dome, bathed in white light. I didn't cry. I didn't toast. I just whispered a thank you. To myself, for not staying small. Returning to Willow Grove after Washington felt like returning to the origin of a revolution. The halls were the same, but nothing was the same. They welcomed me like a war hero balloon's applause, even a homemade banner that read, "Welcome back, our voice." I laughed, I hugged, I held hands. But most of all, I looked at the people who had once slumped in wheelchairs or mumbled in corners, now sitting tall, conversing, asking questions. We had not just written a book. We had rewritten ourselves. In the days that followed, we started receiving letters. Dozens, then hundreds. From strangers, students, grandchildren, caregivers, nurses, politicians, inmates. Yes, even inmates. One letter from a man in a senior prison unit read, I haven't spoken to my daughter in 12 years, but after reading what you wrote about silence not being peace, I called her. She picked up. We spoke for 6 minutes. Thank you. Another from a woman in hospice. I am dying. But before I go, I wanted to say, your stories gave me something to pass on to my granddaughter. She now knows I had fire once too. We pinned some of the letters on the board in the main hall. The one that used to list birthdays and blood pressure clinics. Now it was called Echoes. One morning, while walking the garden paths alone, I found a new plaque had been mounted near the hydrangea beds. Carved into the bronze was a single quote. I am not here to be stored. I am here to be heard. V. Callahan. I stopped breathing for a second. Then Jeanette appeared from behind a bush, her pruning gloves still on. You like it? She asked casually. You did this. Well, the staff offered to plant a tree in your honor. I said you're not dead. You just have good quotes. We laughed until we cried. She never hugged me, but she stood close enough that it felt like one. But not everything changed. One afternoon, I found Grace, the new woman, in Edna's old room sitting on a bench, quietly shaking. I sat beside her. She clutched a folded piece of paper. They want me to sign my house over to my son, she whispered. He says it'll make things easier. For him, I asked. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I took her hand gently and said, you don't have to be angry to say no. You just have to remember that you still get to say it. She didn't reply. But the next day I saw her in the writing circle. She wrote only one sentence that day. I am not an asset. I am a woman with a key. That entry made it into our second anthology. Yes, second. Because one was no longer enough. Priya approached me a few weeks later. Virginia. She said we've been asked to present at a National Elder Care Summit in Chicago. On resident-led community transformation. I'd like you to lead the presentation. I tilted my head. You want me to stand on another stage? She smiled. I want you to stand in your truth. Loudly. Again. I agreed. Not because I needed the spotlight, but because the spotlight needs people like us. People who speak after being silenced, who write after being erased, who demand after being dismissed. We were no longer the exception. We were the example. At the next writing salon, I opened with a journal entry I hadn't shared before. I had written it on my first night in Willow Grove. It read, they brought me here with balloons and quiet betrayal. But they forgot something. I am still a mother, still a fighter, still the woman who won't sit unless she's sitting in her own power. This room may be new, but my story is ancient. And it is not done. When I looked up, the room was still. Tears, smiles, straightened spines. Jeanette muttered, now I gotta follow that, huh? Later that night, I walked the halls after lights out. Just me and the dim night lights casting long shadows across the floor. I passed each room slowly, listening, not for trouble, not for noise, but for life. I heard it in the scribble of pens, the creak of rocking chairs, the quiet rustle of paper being turned. And I realized something. Willow Grove wasn't a facility anymore. It was a press. A printing press of voices once silenced, now speaking in 1,000 tones in 1,000 truths. And I was its first volume, not the last. Never the last. In the months that followed, Willow Grove became something no one could have predicted. A blueprint. Other facilities started reaching out. Emails poured in asking for advice, structure templates from as far as Ireland, Singapore, and Argentina. Advocacy groups requested video calls with our writing circle. Universities asked for interviews. One retirement community in Oregon started their own resident publishing program calling it the Grove Model. It was surreal. We weren't just participants in our own recovery. We had become influencers in a space that had forgotten we existed. But change isn't always welcome. Not everywhere. Some letters we received weren't encouraging. One facility director wrote, your book has caused unrest in our home. Residents are demanding more say in menus activities, and even staff hiring. While admirable, it is disruptive. Disruptive. That word again. The word used when people in power feel questioned by people they assumed couldn't rise. I framed that letter, hung it in the hallway. Underneath it, I wrote in red ink, good. Now they're listening. Meanwhile, our second anthology, Louder Still, was in editing. This time, we included residents' art, sketches, watercolors, photos of their younger selves beside present-day portraits. It wasn't just a book. It was proof that age doesn't mute creativity. It amplifies it. Jeanette contributed a piece titled, "The Day I Stopped Apologizing." It began, "I used to say sorry when I couldn't move fast enough, when my stories went too long, when my laugh was too loud. Now I say you're welcome instead." Harold's new poem was shorter this time, only 4 lines. They cleaned out my closet to make room for my chair, but forgot to ask if I wanted to keep the clutter of memory and me. I wrote something harder this time, more personal. It was a letter I never sent to my husband. He died 10 years ago, quietly, with grace, just the way he lived. But I realized I never told him what happened after he left. How the kids slowly stopped asking what I thought. How my independence became inconvenient. How my identity faded like an old photograph left in the sun. So I wrote, "You were the last person to see me as whole, until I decided to see myself that way again. I wish you could see me now, not because I need your approval, but because I want to show you that I'm not done." I never was. By autumn, our weekly story salons had tripled in size. Even non-residents asked to attend. Priya, always one step ahead, started streaming them online. Our viewership grew. Families tuned in. One woman told me her 14-year-old daughter watched every Friday, calling it Elder TED Talks. We laughed. But something about that stuck with me, because it meant we weren't just making noise in a quiet room. We were echoing into the next generation. And then something unexpected happened. A publisher offered me a solo memoir deal. Me. Virginia Callahan. They wanted my story beginning to present. My gut reaction was to decline. This wasn't about me anymore. But then Jeanette gave me that look. "The louder you get," she said, "the more permission the rest of us feel to speak." So I said yes. I didn't write it like a traditional memoir. No chapters. Just fragments. Vignettes. Moments I'd never shared with anyone. The day my mother slapped me for applying to law school instead of marrying the pastor's son. The first time I sat in a courtroom and realized I was more afraid of silence than of losing. The moment I told Emily I didn't want to be called mom, if that only meant obedience, not relationship. And of course, the day I was left at Willow Grove with a brochure, a suitcase, and a hollow happy birthday. The memoir was titled, "I Wasn't Done." Because that's what I wish someone had asked me. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Do you need help?" But, "Are you done?" And the answer always, always will be, "Not yet." That winter, we celebrated our 1-year anniversary of the writing circle. Instead of cake, we handed out pens. Instead of balloons, we handed out blank journals. We called it the Page One Party, because every voice that had once been silenced now had a first page to begin again. And there, at the front of the chapel-turned-story forge, I stood with a microphone and said the only thing I could. We were told to sit down, so we sat together. We were told to quiet down, so we amplified each other. We were told it was too late. But here we are, writing, living, loud. Spring arrived quietly at Willow Grove. The hydrangeas bloomed early that year, as if even the flowers wanted to participate in our new rhythm. The garden, once empty by noon, was now full of life residents reading aloud, sketching portraits of one another, some just sitting together in comfortable silence. We had stopped waiting for permission. We had started living on our own schedule, and that included dying. Edith passed in April. She was one of the quietest voices in our writing circle, rarely reading aloud, but always listening, always writing. She never complained. Never asked for praise, just slipped her finished pages into the center of the table each week, like sacred offerings. When she died, we discovered something remarkable. She had written her own obituary. It was tucked in the back of her journal, titled, "In case they try to make me sound smaller than I was." It read, "My name is Edith Joan Walters. I loved 5 men, married 1, regretted none. I painted in secret, read erotica in my 60s. I hated cooked carrots. I believed no god ever made a woman just to become someone's duty. I hope I annoyed at least 3 people into becoming better versions of themselves. And I died as I lived underestimated. We read it aloud during her memorial, not in the chapel, not in her room, in the garden, under the blue sky, next to the hydrangeas she'd helped plant. And afterward, we passed around a notebook and wrote what we wanted ours to say. Not because we expected to go soon, but because we refused to let anyone else define our ending. The second volume of our anthology, Louder Still, went live that same week. We dedicated it to Edith. On the dedication page, we printed her final line: "I died as I lived underestimated." Sales doubled. Speaking invitations poured in. A TEDx curator called. We declined and asked if they'd like to speak here instead. They agreed. And soon, Willow Grove would become the first elder care facility to host a TEDx salon. We called it the Echo Stage. Our slogan: we don't whisper anymore. But the change wasn't just external, it was internal. Personal. Emily started writing. At first, it was awkward emails full of vague updates and half apologies. Then came a typed letter, then a short story. She sent it to me with a post-it. "Inspired by you. Be gentle." It was beautiful, clumsy in places, honest in all of them. A story about a daughter who feared becoming her mother, only to realize too late that her mother had always been exactly who she wanted to be. She ended it with, "I see you now," and I believed her. Mark, too, began showing up not just in visits, but in presence. He helped digitize our anthologies, designed a basic website, sat in on our Friday salons, and even read a poem once. We were healing, not because they apologized, but because I stopped needing them to. Their change was never the condition of my freedom. It was only the reflection of their own. Priya, ever the innovator, launched a new initiative: resident editors. Every floor had one. We reviewed internal communications before they went out, chose themes for the weekly menus, curated art for the halls. At 80, I was finally being asked, "What do you think we should do?" And that more than any stage or spotlight was my victory. One afternoon, I visited the front garden and found Grace, formerly timid, formerly trembling, speaking to a group of visiting college students on a field trip. She held up Louder Still and said, "Don't ask us what it's like to be old. Ask us what it's like to still be alive." The students clapped. She winked at me across the path. And I thought, they're not just following, they're leading. We began working on our third book. This one had no theme, no rules. Just a title: Unfiltered. The subtitle: We Already Waited Long Enough. We had submissions from 26 residents, 3 staff members, and 1 administrator, Priya. She wrote a letter called "The Day I Stopped Speaking for Them." In it, she admitted to years of managerial blindness, good intentions gone stale, and the slow corrosion of compassion beneath routine. She ended it with, "You taught me that care isn't compliance, it's conversation. And now I'm finally listening." That night, I sat alone in the chapel and opened my journal. It was almost full. Hundreds of pages, dozens of chapters, so many entries that weren't just about fighting back, but about coming home to myself. And I wrote, "It's easy to think survival is enough. That being alive means you've lived. But now I know the difference. Survival is silence. Living is story." Then I added one more line, "And I'm not done telling mine." By the time summer arrived, Willow Grove was no longer a facility. It was a forum, a studio, a salon, a protest in floral blouses. We had gone from the quiet building past the hill to a pilot site for what national magazines were now calling narrative elder care. A professor from Stanford visited to observe our process. A Netflix documentary team sent an inquiry. Even the local high school started a pen pal program called Letters to the Living Library. It felt like the walls themselves had shifted from places of containment to pages waiting to be written on. And all of it started because someone tried to put me away like a family secret. But not everyone embraced the transformation. A new resident named Walter arrived in late June, a retired Navy commander. Tall, rigid, all sharp corners and silence. He refused to participate in anything, sat alone at meals, said the writing circle was soft. When Jeanette tried to rope him in with one of her infamous jabs, "You afraid of words, sailor?" he replied, "I've seen real battle. I don't need to rehash my feelings to feel alive." It stung, not because he was wrong, but because he was wounded. Deeply. I recognized the armor, I'd worn it too. A few days later, I saw Walter in the garden sitting by the hydrangeas. I brought 2 mugs of tea and sat without asking. For 5 minutes, we said nothing. Then I pulled out a copy of Louder Still and slid it to his side. You don't have to write, I said. But you should know what we've been doing. He didn't look at me, didn't touch the book. But the next morning, it was missing from the bench. And 3 days later, he slipped a folded paper into the submission box outside the salon. No name, no title, just a story about a man who lost his wife during COVID, and with her the last person who knew how to hold his silence without fearing it. We printed it. Read it aloud. No one said his name. But Walter came to the next circle, sat in the back, didn't speak, but nodded. That was enough. For now. By midsummer, we held our first public reading off campus at the local library downtown. 20 residents took the shuttle. Over 100 people showed up. Families, teachers, former caregivers, curious readers, 2 local journalists. We didn't dress up. We didn't dress down. We dressed real. Harold wore suspenders and a tie he hadn't touched since his wife's funeral. Doris wore a velvet shawl her daughter had once told her was too dramatic. And I wore my courtroom scarf. The red one. The one I hadn't worn since retirement. It felt like blood and fire around my neck. We were introduced not as patients, not as survivors, but as authors. And when I stepped up to the mic, I didn't read from the book. I looked straight at the crowd and said, "This isn't about us being inspiring. This is about you remembering what we already know, that aging doesn't erase identity. It deepens it. And maybe you're not here to witness our stories. Maybe you're here to meet the parts of yourself you've been trying to forget." Silence, then clapping, then tears, then questions. Someone asked me, "What would you tell your younger self?" And I said, "You don't owe anyone a version of you they can manage more easily." They wrote it down. Afterward, Walter approached me. He cleared his throat like it was full of gravel. "I'd like to write a letter," he said. "To who?" "To my daughter. Haven't spoken in 17 years. I handed him a pen and a blank sheet of archival grade paper. "Make it count." Back at Willow Grove, we found that change comes in waves. Some fast, some slow, some needing to crash hard before they settle. But each wave carves the shore, and the shore was now lined with people willing to stand up. People who once felt forgotten, now curating art shows, publishing blogs, running workshops for new residents. People like Grace, who now taught a class called The Second Act. People like Jeanette, who kept her edge but softened her silence. People like me, who no longer needed to raise her voice to command a room. I'd become the quiet storm, the one they heard even when I wasn't speaking. One evening, I was alone in the chapel. The light was golden. Dust danced in the beams like punctuation to an unspoken sentence. I lit a candle and sat in the front row. And then I heard it. A whisper. Not ghostly, not divine, just memory. I remembered every version of myself. The bride, the mother, the lawyer, the widow, the woman in the back seat on her birthday, and the woman who stood finally to say, "No." In my journal I wrote, "They tried to quiet me, with kindness, with structure, with logic, but they forgot. My silence was always just a pause, not the end." And beneath it I added, "Speak, Virginia. Speak until they remember that forgetting you was never an option." The final chapter didn't come with a bang. It came with a letter. Official, stamped, addressed to me directly. From the state's Department of Elder Services. They were launching a new initiative, One Inspired. They wrote by our anthology project. A program that would require every long-term care facility in the state to offer residents monthly creative expression workshops, elected resident councils with decision-making power, legal aid consultation sessions for those with active power of attorney concerns, an annual legacy forum for residents to share life stories with local schools. They called it Project Still Here, and in the final paragraph it read, "With respect and admiration, we ask Virginia Callahan to serve as the program's founding advisor." I stared at that page for a long time, not out of disbelief, but out of gratitude. Not for the honor, but for the proof. Proof that stories move governments, that voices rattle doors we've been told are locked, that the breath you waste on whispering can become the wind that shakes institutions. I shared the news at our Friday salon. No confetti, no applause, just knowing glances, tears, one long collective exhale. Then Jeanette stood, of course she did, and announced, "Well, if we're shaping public policy now, I'm going to need a new pair of pants." Laughter, followed by silence. Then Harold stood too. He raised a small notebook trembling in his hand. "I wrote something, my last one," he said. "I'm tired." The room froze. Harold was many things: poet friend, late bloomer, but never tired. Until now. He read, "The chair creaks under my bones, but not my weight. It creaks under stories, and it holds them too." He looked up, eyes glassy, voice a whisper. "I think I'm ready to go." No one stopped him. No one argued. We just let him be heard, because that's what he asked of us from the beginning. He passed quietly 3 weeks later, in his sleep, a pen on his bedside table, the final poem tucked inside his book. We published it posthumously in the third anthology, Unfiltered. The dedication page simply read, "For Harold, who didn't start writing until they told him he couldn't, and never stopped until he said he was done." Summer faded into fall. More residents came. Some left. A few passed. But something held through it all. Something more permanent than breath, voice. We had built something louder than grief, wider than fear, longer lasting than any single life. We had become a library, not of tragedy, but of rebellion, of insight, of proof that growing older doesn't mean shrinking. It means sharpening. On my 81st birthday, I sat alone for just 5 minutes by choice. No one tried to surprise me. No one lured me into a car. Instead, I walked into the garden to find the entire writing circle already waiting. They handed me a notebook, leather-bound, hand-stitched, embossed with one line, "You weren't done." Inside on the first page were notes from every resident. One simply said, "Because you spoke, I remembered how." Another, "Your story let me steal mine back." Another, "I wish my mother had met you, but I'm glad I did." And then, Jeanette's, of course, "Don't let this go to your head. But if they ever name a building after you, I want the gift shop." That night, I sat in the chapel again. One candle, one voice, mine, and I wrote. It started with silence. A brochure, a room I didn't choose, and it became a revolution. Not because I planned it, but because I refused to fold. I paused. Then, for the first time in this entire journey, I allowed myself to write the final entry. I was placed here, but I stood. I was silenced, but I spoke. I was almost erased, but I left a signature instead. And so here I am, not finished, just pausing. Because stories like mine don't end. They echo in every hallway where a woman dares to say no, in every silence broken by a trembling hand holding a pen, in every room where someone sits up, not because they're young again, but because they remember they are still here. I was never asking to be saved, only to be seen, not as a burden, not as a cautionary tale, but as a woman who lived, who lost, who learned, and who refused to vanish politely. To those who put me away on my birthday, you taught me more than you intended. You taught me that freedom isn't given by those who love you. It is reclaimed by those who remember how to love themselves. To every daughter, every son, every caregiver, before you decide someone is too old to choose, ask if you've ever truly listened to what they've already chosen. And to you, yes, you watching this story unfold. You may not be 80, you may not be in a facility, but if you've ever been made small, if you've ever been boxed in, if you've ever been told your voice is too much or too late, then let this be your spark. Write your words. Speak your truths. Walk out of whatever quiet room they tried to leave you in. Because you're not done, neither am I. And here in the pages we wrote with fire instead of ink. We finally remember they never got to decide the ending. We do, so what will yours be?